Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video we're going to talk about the spending multiplier. So I want to start off with this scenario here. So hopefully after looking at this for a few seconds, you see that we're currently in a recessionary or negative output gap. And we know this because the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply is to the left of LRAS, and we also note that Y1 is less than YF, so we're underneath potential GDP or full employment output YF. Now, what I've done this time, though, is I've given these two, the Y's, a number value. So we're going to say these are in billions, 100 billion and $200 billion. And so we see that there's an output gap. We actually can calculate the value of it. The value of the gap is the difference. So the gap's value is 100 billion. So the government faces $100 billion deficit, if you will, in GDP. The government needs to come up with $100 billion worth of GDP. So the question is, let's say the government wants to spend money, right, to solve this problem. Remember, expansionary fiscal policy, as we talked about in the last video. The government can spend money. How much money should the government spend to close this gap? You might think, oh, it's $100 billion. The gap's $100 billion. The government should spend $100 billion. But the answer actually might be a lot less than $100 billion. Why is that? Well, it has to do with this idea of the spending multiplier effect. A lot of text here, so let's break it down. The first one is, it's the idea that a change of X dollars in government spending will change aggregate demand, and therefore real GDP, by an amount of money greater than that X dollar amount that the government initially spent, because money spent by the government becomes income for consumers that they in turn will spend. So if, as an example, very recently, the Biden administration has given people stimulus checks, just like the Trump administration did before then. And this money is going to go into the hands of consumers, right? And the consumers are going to spend that money. And when they spend that money, it goes in the hands of other people. And then they spend the money. And so there's this ripple effect as this money keeps getting spent and spent and spent and spent and spent. And that's going to increase GDP every time that money is spent. Now, it should be noted that consumers, every time they receive some of that money, they're not going to spend all of it. And so eventually that money is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller because, for example, if the government initially were to spend $100 billion, right, and they give that all out to people, right, maybe there's a person who gets, $100 of that, and they're going to save a portion of it, and they're going to spend the rest. So let's say they spend $90 and give that to somebody else, and then they spend a portion of it, and they only spend $70. And so it's going to get smaller. But the thing is, every time there's one of these transactions, it gets added to that total. And so the government's actually creating more real GDP, more spending than what they initially put in, because we count it every time a part of that money gets spent. Think of it like a pebble going into a pond. That's the initial spending. And then those ripples out from the pebble into the pond is the additional spending. So the good news for the government is they don't have to spend as much money as you might think to close these gaps, because the spending multiplier effect will make that money grow a lot larger and can close the gap. And like I said earlier, the more money consumers choose to spend of the income they receive, the greater the spending multiplier effect. But the more money consumers choose to save of the income they receive, the less the spending multiplier effect. So in other words, if you're the government and you don't want to spend a lot of money to close gaps or decrease spending to close gaps, because this can work the other way too. It can work to close inflationary gaps by reducing spending. You want consumers to spend a lot of money. You want consumers not to save their money so you can get the biggest bang for your buck. That's what we're talking about here. Now, we have a way to measure the fraction of a dollar that consumers will spend and save. So we can calculate how big the multiplier is. So we're going to bring back this word marginal. We haven't really talked about the word marginal in a long time. The word marginal here is marginal propensity to consume, MPC. So it's the fraction of a dollar a consumer spends. In other words, if I give you $1, what part of that dollar are you going to spend rather than save? So for example, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.6, this means that a consumer spends 60 cents of every dollar they receive in income. Another example, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.25, this means that a consumer will spend 25 cents on every dollar they receive in income. 0.4, 40 cents of every dollar they receive in income they are going to spend. It is always written as a decimal, always as a decimal. Related to this is, of course, there's a marginal propensity to save. Propensity means willingness. So how much of a dollar are people willing to save? So for example, if the marginal propensity to, I'm sorry, that should say save. Sorry about that. If the marginal propensity to save equals 0.4, a consumer saves 40 cents of every dollar they receive in income. Okay, so every time they get $1, they're going to save 40 cents of it. And I'm sure some of you have already done the math in your head and says, okay, well, if they're saving 40 cents, that must mean they're spending 60 cents. And so you've kind of stumbled on to this rule that the marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save has to equal 1. Why? Because you can only do two things with your money. You can either save it or spend it. And please spare me, all of those of you watching this video who are thinking, yeah, but you could do this with your money too. Stop it, okay? You can either spend it or you can save it. So if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.4, that means the marginal propensity to save has to be 0.6 to add up to the total dollar, because you're given $1, a fraction of it you can spend, a fraction of it you can save. And yes, you can have an MPC of 1 and an MPS of 0, or vice versa, right? It can be that extreme. Typically, it's not, but in fact, we've seen in recent years the marginal propensity to consume really go up over time, which economists feel can be a little dangerous because you do want people saving money in the event of an emergency or some other need. So that's the idea of MPC and MPS. But how can we use that to calculate this spending multiplier effect, that multiplier that's going to expand that initial amount of spending done by the government? So we need a formula, the spending multiplier formula. So the spending multiplier is equal to 1 divided by the marginal propensity to save, or because we know we can rearrange this formula that we just did, and we could say it's also equal to 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Okay? You would be surprised how often you will need this version of the formula, right? Because what the AP people like to do is they know you want them to give you the MPS. So instead, they're going to give you the MPC, make you get the MPS to then get the multiplier. The spending multiplier also is always a positive number. So just keep that in mind. I think the best way to understand this is to practice. So let's do a practice example. So the question is, if the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.5 and the government spends $2 million, by how much will GDP increase? We know that when the government spends money, that increases aggregate demand and therefore GDP. So we just want to know by how much, right? How much is that $2 million going to really mean in terms of spending when it gets into the hands of consumers who then spend it, and those consumers then spend it, and so on. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing we need to do is get the multiplier. We know the multiplier is equal to 1 over the MPS. But the problem is we're given the marginal propensity to consume. But thanks to this formula, we know we can get the MPS by doing 1 over 1 minus the MPC. And so that is equal to 1 over 0.5. Sorry, my Apple Pencil's being a little finicky. So 1 over 0.5. So this is where you got to work with fractions. So what I do is I go ahead and turn this into 1 over 1/2. I know 0.5 is a half. And this is just basically taking the reciprocal of 1/2. So this is equal to 2, right? So you just take the reciprocal of this number, flip the fraction, and you get 2. Practice with it, you'll be fine. So the spending multiplier here is 2, which means an initial $2 million in spending is going to get multiplied by 2. So we actually have a total spending of $4 million, right? Twice as much as what the government initially spent. So you can see how powerful the spending multiplier really is, because you don't have to spend, if we go back to my first example, you don't have to spend $100 billion to close a gap. You can spend a lot less than that if you know at least the MPC, how much people are willing to spend, and you can get how much they're willing to save, get the multiplier, and figure out, okay, how much would I need to spend? And sometimes an AP question will do that. They'll give you the total, right? They'll give you the 4 million, and they'll give you a way to get the multiplier, and they'll say, okay, how much would the government need to spend, knowing the multiplier and knowing the size of the gap to close the gap, right? So they'll give you the answer and part of the question and have you figure out the other part. And again, the only way to get good at this is to practice. So I encourage you to practice calculating the multiplier. Usually what they will do is they'll give you a multiplier that's very easy to calculate. So they have to give you a fraction here that's really easy to work with. So they're not going to do like 3/4 for an MPC, because then the MPS is 4 over 3. So like they're not going to give you anything really weird that's going to mess with you. So that's all for this video on the spending multiplier. Until next time, have a great day.